Well, why don't you go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name's John Weston.
And I'm Harold Wong.
Welcome to our session. In this session, we want to show you what we've built. We've built a lab environment for the Microsoft Private Cloud using System Center. And it wasn't just Harold and I. Harold and I are on a team called Developer Platform Evangelism at Microsoft, and our role in that is IT evangelism. So we do anything IT Pro related. And so there are 12 of us here in the United States that do this. And so we got together and said, what do we want to do to show off or practice our skills with the System Center? And so we decided to put together a lab environment. And you would think Microsoft's got a lot of servers and we could just go out there and build that anywhere. That was a little more difficult than we thought because we wanted to expose it so we could have access to it anywhere that we might want to be doing a demonstration. And so we built this for our own use, for our own knowledge, and for us to use as a way to demonstrate what can be done out there and build it. And so we did a lot of documentation, kind of our methodology to give you just a little bit of behind the scenes. Was we went out there with 4 of us and built it in a week, start to finish, bare metal servers, all the way to having it done and attempted to document it. We then deleted it. We wiped everything out, gave the documentation to the next group of 4 people and see if they could recreate it. And that document evolved over time as we went through 3 iterations of this, of rebuilding the environment that we built. So as you can see here, our contact information, Harold and I both blog on Microsoft's TechNet site. We also are pretty active on Twitter. Harold's Harold Wong. I'm known as TechNet Guy on Twitter. So let's just kind of go through some of the, I promise not death by slides here. We'll get through the slides pretty quickly. But everybody realizes what's going on. You know, this is we put this slide in here for a lot of talks that we use this for that may not necessarily be involved with understanding of what cloud computing is all about, the difference between private cloud and public cloud, and how all that is evolving in the enterprise space today. And so we really kind of go through and explain a little bit of that. I think in our context here, what you've all been through today, you get that. And so we looked at the different pieces here of the way that cloud architecture is delivered. Software as a service being, our Office 365 offerings, our platform as a service, as Windows Azure, infrastructure as a service is really more of the pipe or the plumbing that allows you to be able to build out the architecture, whether it be private or public. Some people think that because it's infrastructure as a service, it has to be private cloud, and that's not really part of the definition of the way that works. But all these are pieces of the way that we build IT as a service, allowing us to, with the tools that are out there today, especially about all the announcements today at the keynote, allowing us to be able to build out and provide a level of service to our end users or to the applications that we support. You probably have seen this slide before. I'm not going to go into great detail on it. It's a slide that's used in a lot of sessions where Microsoft explains what private cloud is all about. But here it basically takes an overview of the different components of System Center and how we can use all those different pieces to deliver as a service. So you as the data center administrator over on the right-hand side here, what tools do you have and how you can use those? And so we wanted to put in all those different pieces in our test lab environment. And again, I'm not going to go through in great detail here. You probably have seen that slide before. So before you go and build your own private network, you first got to think about what are we going to build this on. And as presenters from Microsoft and academic, folks that are out there in the field, we have laptops. And we've done a lot of demos on our laptops before, but if you try to build out this entire infrastructure on a laptop, it's pretty hard. Okay? There's a lot, not having enough memory, having enough network cards. And so we put together a proposal to our management that said, give us 5 servers, and that was really an interesting thing because we wanted to put them in a Microsoft building and really had difficulty finding a place to put them. So these are actually hosted out at one of our partners and wanted to build out this entire infrastructure. And then Harold put together a design architecture to say, okay, here's what we're going to go build and here's what our end result's going to look like. And we even exposed it out there on the internet. What's the domain name?
itprosrock.com.
itprosrocks.com is our domain name, and so we have access to all of that, and so we can dial into that, and Harold's going to start showing you the demos. Again, not much slides here. We're going to get straight into the demos. So we wanted to show all the different pieces. We wanted to show everything from self-service, scalability, elasticity, and pooling of your resources to make it a truly private cloud, not just a virtualized environment. And so this slides here show a little bit about the hardware. There's just a great picture of them in the rack. We did use Dell servers. We had 5 individual servers, the first 2 being our Hyper-V servers, and we did want to deploy VDI. So we do each of us have a Windows 7 machine that we can dial into that's hosted through our VDI sessions. We wanted to also create a development environment because a lot of the team members that we have in our team are also developers, and so once we had this up and running, we want to offer this as a resource for them to do as a test environment as well. And then our virtual machine storage area, Harold will talk more about what we put on that last machine.
And before you go on, just real quick, how many of you have actually kind of built up a highly virtualized environment? I'm just curious, right? So it looks like at least 40% of you are virtualized. Nobody else is virtualizing anything? No? Okay, you guys just don't want to respond or answer. It's the end of the day. So hopefully
they need more caffeine.
Everybody is virtualized, right? And if you're starting to build out a lab to really dig into private cloud, do you guys all have spare servers sitting around, spare SAN devices, iSCSI devices sitting around? So
he does.
Your name is Fleming? So Fleming is going to offer up his resources so everybody can also do the same because he's got spare stuff just sitting around. Right? So what John was talking about, and I wanted to throw this in, is we had no spare hardware and no spare storage devices. We had laptops that if you try to carry 6 laptops through TSA,
they really don't like
you. For
you
one, people look at you funny, and it's a pain in the back. Right? It's going to kill me, and it's going to kill John. So we virtualize literally everything. And we don't have SAN storage or iSCSI storage, and hence why you see a Dell server that's acting as our storage. And I did want to point that out now. This is our entire infrastructure is all virtualized, nothing running bare metal in terms of our domain controllers. And so we're going to share some of the challenges we faced in just kind of not doing things in production anymore, because we don't get to do that. So some of our learnings, and hopefully you won't make some of the same mistakes we did in trying to build out your lab, because that's what this is really about, building out a lab first.
Yeah, and so there's no magic SANs. These 5 servers, that's it. That's all we had in our entire environment. So here's what we started with. This is our roadmap of what we wanted to build out with IP addresses included here and the networks. And one of the first things I want to kind of point out here is that we didn't just have one network. We wanted to create virtual networks. So we had a management connection, we had a storage network, and then what would you call it, Thumper? Was that the end up name, the Thump network? So that would be our production environment. And so you can see where we created the virtual networks across that and the different infrastructure that we put that. You want to tell some more about how you designed this network?
Actually, I do want to point out, Dan Stoltz, one of our teammates, actually put up this particular Visio diagram, and I just modified it from there because I didn't have time to do that, so I want to, it was a joint effort. But ultimately, we wanted to make sure that we could run our entire infrastructure, so have domain services, have email, have everything that any normal company would have, and then on top of that, build a private cloud that took advantage of all of those intricacies and the tie-ins. Right? And that's why we did it this way with the servers, and if my manager would have given me another $50,000, I probably would have had some real good NetApp storage or something better than what we had here, and probably a few more servers. Right?
We did with what we had. So there's a little bit of specs here about the networking that we put together, like our confidential there. And then there's the configuration of each of the servers. If you want these slides I know are going to be on Harold's blog and on my blog. Our cards are up here on the stage if you want to get copies of those. So if you didn't write down our blogs, you have an access to go through all of that. So instead of boring you with all the different what's on each of the individual components, why don't we show it to you? So let me just skip ahead and get directly to the demo slide, and we'll switch Harold over. So Harold's going to use from his machine, and he's going to connect into this production environment and show you what we built.
Okay, so the title was 1,000 tiny steps or 1,000 easy steps. And how many of you guys and gals would actually agree or believe that it really is only 1,000 simple steps? Right? Does it really only take 30 seconds to provision a private cloud? Right? Nothing against the keynote. I love the keynote, but the piece that took 30 seconds was once the entire infrastructure was built out, it took 30 seconds to define a cloud within System Center. Right? Then somebody could use that cloud. That's what took 30 seconds. but it was all the other stuff that took time. So since not everybody raised their hand on doing virtualization, I'm going to ask anyways, how many of you have actually built a private cloud then? Right? So a lot fewer hands. Less than a dozen hands are up, which means everybody else is hopefully going to take that thumb drive with all the bits and start working on something in their lab. So the whole idea of this session really is to share the learnings that me and my team kind of experienced and what we learned as we try to build out a lab. And not everybody has lots of hardware. I'm short. I'm going to do something that hopefully nobody gets mad at me and yells at me for. I guess I can't, but I'm going to try it anyways. I'm going to lay this down. Do you have to do that? I'm just short, and I know people can't see me. Not that you want to see an ugly face anyways, but there we go. There you go. I don't need that monitor. Okay, now you can see me, and I can actually see you guys. I like to see the people I'm talking to. So the whole idea here is to really share what I learned, what my teammates learned as we made mistakes, right? Because setting this up is not the most straightforward, or it possibly isn't the most straightforward. There's a lot of parts, a lot of moving pieces. And if you look at any of those pre-validated configurations, you will probably notice that none of them have only 2 servers or 4 servers, right? They all have probably 5 to 8 servers in the mix. And in addition to that, there's some storage, and there's some good networking gear and so forth. So what we did with 5 servers is built out a very small environment that we could learn from and then use to demo with. Right? So we decided that we needed to do live migration. We needed high availability. So what's the first thing you need if you're going to do high availability? Shared storage, right? Once again, my VP said I only had $25,000 to play with. It seems like a lot, but it really isn't. Right? When you consider each server costs about $5,000, and storage costs about 15 grand. So I had a NIC storage, and instead, all of our servers have 2 terabyte SATA drives, right? A bunch of them. So the VM storage server is just another Dell 710 server, R710, with 6 drives in there. And I installed the nice, wonderful free tool. So let me go show you this server. We installed the iSCSI target software. Right? It's free. It is to a degree supported, and it does work. And I'm using low-end storage that we took 6 drives, put them in array 10 configuration, so that I'm exposing about 5.5 terabytes of raw storage for use. Right? And one of the limitations of VHD files today is what? 2 terabytes. I heard that over there. So we created some 2 terabyte VHD files and exposed it as a LUN, or a couple of LUNs, to our Hyper-V kind of nodes in the cluster. But the first thing we had to do was set up our storage environment. So if you come over here, you'll see that I've actually got a couple of iSCSI targets that I'm actually exposing. I know this is not a session about configuring iSCSI storage, but if you're trying to set up your lab and you kind of encounter the same bottlenecks that I have when it comes to funding, you probably might have access to some cheap servers that might have some cheap storage, and for a lab environment, this is just fine. Right? I'm not in the environment where I need high-end performance. Yes, I might be running 20 or 30 VMs, but I don't need millisecond response times. I just need to be able to show that something works and demo it and kind of walk through and learn from it. So that's why we did it this way. And if I show you my server storage itself, you'll see there's the 5-point-something terabytes, of which I only have 271 gigs free. And that's because I've got a bunch of VHD files. Right? There's the quorum, or the witness, and then a couple of VMs. For VM storage, I've also got a file server disk that I'm exposing as just shared storage for our library for VMM. Right? Kind of makes sense? So the first part is you do need shared storage. And that's why we have a server dedicated to just storage. And then I also have Hyper-V 1 and Hyper-V 2, where we installed the failover cluster service. And then I also have the iSCSI initiator. And from here, I went ahead and connected to the storage. Right? And you can see I've actually got a couple of them already pre-configured. I don't want to do anything here where I try to connect to yet another LUN, because I'll screw something up. Right? Because I don't have anything there. And I don't want to try to reinitialize, because I've actually got VMs going. And if my VMs go down right now, I will lose connectivity to my environment. Because remember, everything is virtualized, including the RD gateway that I'm using for my remote desktop session. Because I'm not a fool. Right? I'm not going to expose port 3389 directly to the internet, to my entire environment, for yahoos like you guys, or people like you guys to accidentally connect to. Right? Because people like to, that's why I kind of put confidential, our public IP is not exposed right now, but we will have a lot more access once we get everything to RTM. Because I don't know if you, well, you'll notice it in a little bit, everything is still running on RC code, because we have not had time to kind of blow everything away or do any kind of upgrades, because we're using it on a regular basis. And for this event, I don't want to take the chance of starting the upgrade process only to not complete and not have anything to demo with. That would have been ugly and not good. But either way, I did connect the iSCSI targets so that we had storage. And the way this works is if I go look at my C drive, once I get everything configured, I will have a folder called cluster storage. And in there, I'm going to have multiple volumes that really point to the different LUNs that I'm actually connecting to. So this is one of the LUNs. The other one right now really isn't being used much. There's only a few items there. So that's kind of the baby steps, right? And I think everybody understands the basics of networking. You have to have multiple network adapters as well. I can't imagine you do any less than 4 adapters per server if you're going to start doing virtualization. So we have, all of these came with 4 network adapters. And so if I look at Hyper-V 1, you'll see that I've got my CorpNet that all my clients are going to access. I've got a storage network. I've got my heartbeat network. I do have management on a different one, and somebody's playing around and created a loopback adapter. Dan, was that you? Okay. I point to Dan because he tends to do it's something that you probably would have done. So somebody's done something there, and I don't want to mess with that. But either way, we do have 4 physical adapters. And once we created the cluster, let me bring up my cluster manager here. And by the way, was everybody in the keynote this morning? So most of you? Part of the thing that you can do, or one of the nice things you can do in VMM 2012 or Virtual Machine Manager as part of System Center 2012 is actually add nodes to the cluster without having to use Cluster Manager, right? Provided you've got storage that can be provisioned correctly. And one of the challenges we encountered during the release candidate, and I haven't played with this in the RTM, is the iSCSI software that we're using that comes with server isn't really VMM friendly. So that's one of the challenges, and hence why we do have to do this manually right now, right? Because it doesn't recognize that storage as kind of configurable iSCSI. So there's a few challenges there. Either that or we did something wrong. I don't know. Could be the case. But either way, we do have our 2 nodes as part of the cluster. So there's Hyper-V 1, and then we have Hyper-V 2. If you look at the cluster shared volumes, you can see that we do have the shared volumes here and the different networks, right? So main, storage, and thumb. And our cluster is actually called Cluster F. We skip right to F, right? We thought that would be funny. I mean, we're all IT pros, we're all geeks here, so we thought that would be fun. But either way, we did set up the cluster environment first, because once again, we didn't already have infrastructure, and if you're trying to stand up your lab, you're probably going to be in the same boat as us, right? You're not going to have a bunch of infrastructure that you can just tag onto. So you're going to have to build up that infrastructure first. And so we had to build up our infrastructure. So we had our cluster. And then from there, we went ahead and added in all of our VMs. So here you can see across the different nodes, or if I just look at the services, you can see we've got a bunch of VMs running on the cluster, of which there's a domain controller, Exchange server, and then all of the different system center components. We built out, or I started building out some of the stuff. So there's a domain controller that we built out, and we put the domain controller into the cluster, right? Made it highly available. We started building out all of our infrastructure. That week we were there, Monday through Friday, we built out all the physical servers. We built out the cluster. We built out all of our VMs. We built out the core infrastructure. And we built out all the private cloud components. And then we kind of left, right? And on Friday, as we were leaving, we had to do some reconfiguration, because one of the other things I found out is if you're trying to do any of this on a 100 meg network, you might as well go shoot yourself, because it's not going to work, right? It was a little tiny mistake we realized, because our entire environment is hosted through a partner, Groupware Technology, free of charge, right? Because, as John said, we try to go to Microsoft IT to get some hosting, and Microsoft IT runs their shop as IT as a service. So they said, we'd be more than happy, Harold, to provide you with services. It's going to cost you $300 per server per month to host it in our data center. I kind of didn't have that kind of money, right? I only had $25,000, and that I needed to buy hardware with, not to host services. So Groupware kind of set up all this stuff, and they gave us the networking, the rack space, public IPs, everything for free. One of the things they didn't pay attention to was they put us all on a 100 meg switch. And as we were trying to spin up servers, it would take 15 minutes to start up a VM. I'm like, what the heck is going on? We finally figured it out that we were on a 100 meg switch. We kind of scrambled and put up a temporary gig switch so that we could be functioning, right? And then on Friday, we shut everything down as we were leaving, because it's all in Campbell, so Northern California, heading to the airport, and they rewired a few things, put in a much better switch, managed switch, and then they powered things back up. Well, the core servers all started with no problem, right? All the Dell servers, they booted up. I had the auto start for everything to auto start. So all the VMs should have restarted. And we couldn't connect. Things weren't working. What do you think the problem was? So, yeah, so over here I heard cluster services wouldn't start. Why is that? Virtual domain controller. Well, it's not that the domain controller was virtualized. It's that the domain controller was in the cluster. We had two domain controllers, highly available as part of the cluster. And we all know that, that cluster services require domain services, right? So it has to authenticate to a domain controller before the cluster services start. So they wouldn't start until my domain controller started. Well, my domain controllers wouldn't start until the cluster server started. So here I am, thought everything was good to go, and we had squat. Nothing, right? We took about 48 hours to connect in and move one of our domain controllers over to one of our other servers, and then we learned, right? It's something that, because I've been with Microsoft almost 13 years, I don't support production environments anymore, right? My environment is this laptop, a lab environment. And so what if the domain controller is not going to boot up? I can get there. It works, right? It's not production. I don't think about officially supported configurations anymore. And in a lab, I figured, who cares? It's a lab, right? I don't need a physical DC. I didn't have one to begin with. So that was a learning. Don't make that same stupid mistake we did. Right? It took us 48 hours to correct that remotely, which was very painful. So now, DC2 sits on a different server. It's still virtualized, right? Everything is virtualized, but now at least DC2 starts up, and then the cluster starts up, and life is good, right? So that was one of our first learnings. The other learning that we had is as you define your cloud infrastructure and you start utilizing VMM to really start deploying things, right? Because that's the whole idea, is using System Center and Virtual Machine Manager to deploy stuff, right? So let me go ahead and go over here. Right? You want to come into your Virtual Machine Manager, you want to go to the library, you want to say, all right, I want to take this particular, where is it at? We got so much crap in here. No, it's not. No, so I want to take a server and I want to go ahead and deploy this, or I want to go use my self-service portal and I've exposed VMs in there and service templates that my users can go and deploy. Well, they go deploy, and next thing you know, in our environment, it fails. Because, once again, Harold wasn't thinking. We created some nice VMs, put it all on the cluster, highly available environment, and I created a VHD with the C drive definition of 250 gig. Don't ask me why, but I did. Right? Virtual Machine Manager is smart, smarter than me. Right? And it's looking and it's saying, okay, Harold, you've deployed, let's count these virtual machines over here in my production cloud. Look at all those VMs in the production cloud. They're all running in the, most of them are running in the cluster. 250 gig, even though I'm doing dynamic disks, and it's really not consuming more than about 12 to 15 gig per VM, Virtual Machine Manager, once again, is smarter than me, and it's saying, Harold, you're trying to deploy a VM to storage, and you only have 4 terabytes of storage. So let's add that up, Harold. 250 gig times 4 VMs is already 1 terabyte, right? And I've got a boatload of these defined. Well, I've over-provisioned my storage. I can't even demo properly anymore. I've got to go move things around just so that I can try to do some demos, right? Because it doesn't work right. So Virtual Machine Manager and bringing up these private cloud or the self-service portal doesn't work 100%. I've got to kind of circumvent what we've done and not deploy to the highly available cluster unless I manually deploy. And if I manually deploy, then of course I'm using Hyper-V Manager and just overriding whatever it is because it just will fit and it'll run. Life is good. So as you start looking at building out your lab environment, really think about what it is that you're going to do, right? Are you going to have servers that you're going to deploy to limited storage for proof of concept testing? If so, then don't do the stupid thing that I did, which is create definitions of VHD files that are 250 gig. Because it's not like they're needed. I don't know what I was thinking. I was probably tired, and it was 2 a.m. in the morning, and I just decided, hey, you know, just in case, like Dan needs to create a SQL server, and he filled up the disk anyways, right? So it worked for the SQL server. So that's just another learning, right? Make sure you define your VHD files, you know, small, medium, large, and do things appropriately. That was another big piece. So now if I try to go deploy something, like I said, it's just not going to work. Now, I'm assuming most of you have probably gone through some of the different sessions and already seen Virtual Machine Manager and how to define the public or define a cloud. And during the keynote today, essentially what VJ did, right, he just came in over here and defined a new cloud. And from defining a cloud, that really is only a 30-second process to do the definition. But it's setting up all the other components, all the fabric pieces, that's what really takes time. And if you're, once again, in a low-budget kind of environment like we are, if you try to come in and configure some of the fabric environments, or the fabric pieces, let me come over here, like the storage, I cannot add storage in. I can't define the classifications of storage. Well, I could define classifications, but I can't actually associate storage here. Even if I had space on my VM storage server, I could not put it into this piece. Why? Because our iSCSI target is not SMIS compliant. And therefore, I can't add it in and do any of the storage management. So as you think about creating and managing your lab environment, please think about what you're eventually going to do in production and somehow replicate enough of it into your lab so that you can really put it to the test. Right? For us, it's not as important. I would love to get some storage. So if anybody from in here is from NetApp, maybe you can work with me to get me some low-end storage. I don't know, right? I'll beg, borrow, and steal as best I can. But the key is as you start creating your lab environment, please try to get some iSCSI or Fiber Channel or some kind of storage that emulates what you have in production so that you can actually come in and start configuring all of the different components that you plan to use in production. Or you'll be in the same boat as us, which is can't configure anything over here. Right? When you look at your networking, once again, you do need to make sure that you have the appropriate networking switches and networking gear that you can add in and then do the provisioning. I only have one switch, so it's not, and every port is pretty much taken already, so it's not like I can do anything here, once again, in our lab environment. But please, duplicate what you can in your lab that you're going to have in production. A very, very important part. Am I too basic for you guys, or is this kind of helping a little bit? Good? All right. Now, also from a library perspective, I don't know how you guys normally function or where you guys would store your library. We had multiple hands in the pot, so we have like multiple libraries that have duplicate content. So please take time to define what you're going to store in your library and the architecture of your library. Right? So right now, we've got ISO images. We've copied a bunch of stuff into our shared location, and it just all shows up in here, which is a big mess because we haven't cleaned it up. I'm afraid to come in and delete something because if it was John that put it in there and he really meant to do that, I don't want to go and screw it up. So everybody's leaving. Sorry if it wasn't to your needs, but hopefully you got a little something out of it. But either way, come in here and do some cleanup because I've got INI files, I've got all kinds of stuff in here that is not pertinent. And it's just clutter. So as you start looking at your library, I would probably have one library with ISO images, another library that you're going to actually use to store the VHD files that you have, and maybe even a third one that's going to be used for storing your server app V kind of packages or different packages that you would use to also build out service templates. Right? It's, I think, a key piece to have some level of organization. And honestly, I think we're going to just blow this whole environment away and reinstall with Server 2012 beta. I'm so used to saying Server 8 beta. But take advantage of some of the new things in Server 2012 because this is a lab environment, right? What else is there? Yes? And by the way, if anybody has questions, please ask. I would ask that you go to the mic so that it gets captured because I think this is being recorded. Okay, fine. I'll just repeat your question. Okay, so the question is, comment question, I'm running Virtual Machine Manager in a VM. What are the ramifications of actually doing that in production? Right, what do I lose or what could possibly go wrong? So one of the things is, if I remember correctly, it is going to be supported, or it is supported, to run VMM in a VM. Right? The challenge you have is I can't use VMM to manage that VM 100% correctly. So as an example, if I try to do a live migration of my VMM VM, I'd be stupid. Right? Because it won't live migrate. It'll actually hang, and I don't want to do that right now, but I could, right? Because I've done it, right? It starts the process, but because it's VMM that's running all the jobs, all the scripts, it's going to eventually start the migration, and then it's just going to fail, at least in the release candidate. It's fixed in RTM. You can. Okay, so you can't you can't do a storage migration, but you can live migrate with RTM. So it is fixed, and I expected that in RC, right? So there are a few things that you just have to be careful with. And I would make sure that if you're going to run it in a VM, that you also make it highly available. So that if something does happen to the host, that it can fail automatically to some other machine, that will start it back up and you're good to go, right? If the Hyper-V host fails, it's not a live migration at that point. You're going to start it back up as if somebody just literally pulled the power cord out of the physical box and it comes back online. But at least it comes back online. So that's one of the things is you do lose certain migration pieces, but it is possible. It is supported. VMM 2008 was not supported in a VM, right? That's when I first started working with it. I did it anyways because I had no choice. When you only have one laptop, you can only do so much, and you have to virtualize everything. And if you're going to build out a private cloud lab environment with only 5 servers, I know we say that only 5 servers, you have to virtualize everything. Right. Does that answer your question, though? Okay. Any other questions at this point? And by the way, you're more than welcome to ask. I would love this to be kind of interactive. 42. That's the answer. So, question is, you've heard that you can virtualize every domain controller except the time server component or the PDC emulator maybe. Is that still true with Server 2012? So I honestly don't know what the support stance will be for Server 2012, but I know that we've done a lot to make domain controllers virtualization aware, well, super virtualization aware and 100% supported. Today, I would argue that you can virtualize your PDC emulator, right? There are best practice guidances that you should follow on what you should be doing. And we do it. Admittedly, it's not production, but I would do it in production in a heartbeat. Now, there is best practice that says you should still have one physical domain controller in your environment just to be safe. Right? Have you guys heard that? Right? And it doesn't hurt. If you have an old server that's not doing anything anyways, and it's not like you can put Hyper-V on it because it can't handle it, then why not make it a domain controller, kind of set it away, and that's your physical backup just in case something really screws up. Most people in a production environment can do that. But I've seen documentation already, and I think it's already public, that we're doing a lot around ensuring domain controllers will be virtualization friendly or more friendly. Outside of that, I don't want to say anything else because I don't want to get in trouble for saying the wrong thing. I'll leave it up to Jeff Woolsey and his team to really talk about the Server 2012 environment right now. Pardon? Yeah, so common is you can always disable the time sync kind of feature that's part of the integration services or the integration components so that the domain controller in the VM doesn't sync with your host. That's one option. I like to take my PDC emulator and sync it with a time server, and then everything else syncs with that, including my host. Right? Honestly, I sync my host to a time server or some master source. Oh, great question. Are my physical boxes a member of the domain? The answer is yes. There's only one that's not, and it's development, because I don't trust developers. Are there any developers in here? Right? I can only trust them as far as I can throw them, and I'm a short dude, not very big, so I can't throw them very far. So I generally don't trust my fellow developer teammates. I keep very tight rein on what they're allowed to do. So that one is not part of the domain. And I also did that for a reason, because I also want to be able to show that over here I can still, within Hyper-V or within System Center Virtual Machine Manager, I can still manage that server, even though it's not a member of the domain. I just have to add or install the agent. So there's a couple of steps I have to follow, and I would treat it like it was a DMZ type server. But I can still manage it with no problem. I can still expose that host to my developers via the self-service portal so that they can still deploy templates to that host, even though it's not a member of the domain. So that's not a problem. Yes? Okay, so since my domain controller is in the cluster, don't I still have that same problem that I talked about earlier? No, because I have another host called VDI, and that's where I run DC2. It's part of the production cloud. It's part of my infrastructure environment, but that is on a separate non-clustered Hyper-V host, and therefore that one starts first. And so long as DC2 eventually gets up, my clusters will eventually get up or start up. And once the clusters start up, all my VMs in that cluster will eventually start up. It takes time. The way we've got it, there's coordination of service. When we have planned downtime, the boot process is always to boot VDI first. And then give VDI about 15 minutes to really start. It's amazing that it takes less time to install server onto that physical box than it does to reboot the server. Right? Hence why virtualization is a big plus to getting 3 or 4 nines of uptime. Right? So VDI always comes up first. Right? Groupware technology knows that. They've got a big old sheet that says VDI, this server always comes on first. And 15 minutes after it's been up, then they boot the rest, right? VM storage, and then Hyper-V 1, 2, and development. So there's a very specific boot order. So the comment, and we consider this as well, is we can also put DC2 or DC1 on the cluster node, but put it on locally stored, on the local storage, so that when at least the server boots up, Hyper-V can still start. It's just that the cluster service doesn't start, and the domain controller could still come up online. Yes, that is an option, but I honestly did not want anything on local storage, right? Because the whole idea was we're going to virtualize everything and make everything that's highly available on the Hyper-V hosts that were part of the cluster would always be in the cluster storage. Although Young violated that kind of guidance, and he put a bunch of stuff on local storage. And once again, in order for us to demo anything today, that's the only way we can do it anyways. Right? If I want to use Virtual Machine Manager to deploy anything, I've got to deploy it to local storage on Hyper-V 1 or Hyper-V 2, or to VDI, or to development, because Hyper-V 1 and Hyper-V 2 from a highly available perspective, not available until I rebuild, because I screwed up. That was my fault, right? And I found that out as my teammates were emailing, Harold, I think you broke something. Because all my VMs, every time I try to deploy something, it doesn't deploy. I'm getting errors that the cluster is over-provisioned. And we can't tell why it's over. And I looked at it and I thought about it. I'm like, oh, shoot. So I logged into DC1, and sure enough, 250 gig C drive. I'm like, oh, I used that same VHD, right, that base VHD for all our production VMs. Stupid me. So learning. I make mistakes too. I'm not perfect. Although I tell my kids I'm perfect. They don't believe me anyway, so it doesn't really matter. They're teenagers. So Does that answer, or, so the comment there is a valid one, although I personally would not do that because, once again, unless you're going to really do that in your production environment, I still wouldn't do it in the lab environment. If you're going to virtualize all your domain controllers, I would still split the domain controllers so that they're virtualized across different types of hosts. And hopefully in your production environment, you actually have that best practice physical domain controller, and then you're good to go anyways. Yes? Oh, sure. You want to see the error? Let me show you. Let's make it crash, baby. Oh, that is just wrong. That is wrong. You go now. You've been here for an hour. And we've actually, I think we've all the IT evangelists have gotten good at logging in with their own login credential and not as administrator, right? So I almost made the mistake of logging in as administrator. But here's my environment. So let me go look at the library. Templates. So as an example, let's go ahead and just try to deploy this small web server to Harold's cloud. And I have unlimited resources. Harold PC. Everything else I'm good with. We'll put in a password of password. And then click OK. And hit deploy. So now we can see that the job was started, right, because it's nice enough to tell me that. If I look at the jobs, you'll see it's in progress. And I should, bless you, by the way, if I go to Cluster Manager, where is it putting it? I didn't specify where it's. It's trying. It's easier to come over here and look at the job in VMM. Okay, so it says the VM could not be placed due to the following issues. And it says there's no highly available host to select from, right? Why? Because the highly available hosts are over-provisioned. And therefore, it's going to fail. And it did fail. Right? So you can see that it didn't do it. Object was deleted. So life kind of sucks for me right now. But I can at least walk you through. Yeah. So it's a great demo of why Harold screwed things up and how at least I accept it and I know what I did wrong. I just can't fix it. Right? Not easily. Until somebody comes up with an easy way to shrink. No, it doesn't shrink the VHD definition without shutting everything down and using a third. Yeah. So and I couldn't really afford to shut everything down one at a time unless I'm doing it on a weekend without affecting my teammates. And my wife doesn't like it when I work on Saturdays. Can't blame her, right? There's always something going on. But does that make sense? Right, so as you start looking at the private cloud, it's not 1,000 easy steps. It's not 1,000 tiny steps. It's probably more like 10,000 steps if you're going to do everything manually. Because I didn't even talk about installing SQL. That was 1,000 just by itself. And also you have to think about it, how do you manage SQL? Do you have a central SQL set of SQL servers that your DBA or your SQL team manages, and then you tie into that? Yeah, SQL is virtualized. Absolutely. Remember? Everything for us is virtualized. So let me just show you. Here's my SQL server, and it is in the cluster. It is absolutely virtualized. Yeah, so the question is, for SQL, did we have any issues with the instances of SQL? Right? So yes, we actually have multiple instances that are created for different components of System Center. And we decided to go with a centralized SQL server, so there's only one SQL server. So when Dan decides to do backups of that SQL server and consume all the disk space in that VM, and SQL Server goes down, every System Center component fails. And then everybody blames Harold until I find out that it was Dan who screwed everything up, right? So, and that's actually what happened, right? Dan's laughing. We laugh about it because we're not SQL administrators. I'm not a SQL person. Are anybody in here SQL folks? So a few of you, see, I know SQL well enough to install it and do some basic configuration so that I can get, back in the days, SMS going, right? So now it's config man, virtual machine manager, everything is stored in SQL. So I know how to configure SQL well enough to get those individual components going. But as you look at your lab environment, once again, how are you going to do SQL? Right? Are you going to set up SQL so that each one has SQL local? Because that's what you plan to do in production? Or do you have a central SQL server? And is it clustered? If it's clustered, I would highly encourage you to set up a clustered SQL in your lab as well. And yes, you can cluster SQL in VMs. Right? There's a little bit of work to do guest level clustering, but you can do it. But it is supported today. So I didn't want to do it because we didn't have the hardware to do it. Right? I literally don't have the ability to do guest level clustering with what we have today. From a storage perspective, I can't expose the storage appropriately. Yeah, you have to use iSCSI, but remember, my iSCSI is not performant enough for what I need to do, so that would just kill me. Right? Unless, once again, somebody works for NetApp, wants to throw some, just a spare SAN that they don't need anymore, I want to throw it my way. I won't complain if you just want to give it to me. So that's another piece, right? It's setting up all that core infrastructure that has nothing to do with private cloud. Absolutely nothing to do with private cloud, but that's still important. So SQL is a key backbone component that you absolutely have to have. Right? Another thing, as you start setting up your lab, does everybody in their lab environment have internet access? Right? Well, initially we didn't. We didn't set up our lab when we were initially installing. We didn't think internet connection was that high on the list. Right? The partner was giving us free space already, and as we started to install, one of the things you find out about, say, Configuration Manager is it doesn't install unless it can go out and download some packages. So either you have to have internet access or you have to go somewhere and download it and then copy it to the VM. So there's a lot of different pieces, parts and moving parts and pieces that you don't think about in a lab environment. Right? Production, of course, you're going to have internet connectivity, but in a lab you may not. So we had to hurry up and stand up and get internet connectivity going, and I had to go pull my buddy Ed Horley up and say, "Hey, can you please patch us out to the internet so that we can have internet connectivity?" And so he did that for us. Right, so our VMs or our environment could go out on the internet as well. Just little things that you don't think about, and hopefully as you learn from our little mistakes, you set up some kind of internet connectivity for your lab environment as well. A piece that we don't have, and I know Dan gives me a hard time about this all the time, is backup. Nowhere in this mix, if you look, do I have Data Protection Manager? I have no backup. And even if I wanted to, I still wouldn't, I couldn't bring myself to install DPM into a VM, because that one to me seems ludicrous, right? The fact that I'm backing everything up from a VM that could go down anyways, right? And plus I don't have storage. So once again, I don't have backup. So hopefully in your lab environment, you actually can stand up your backup solution, because that is a very, very key piece. I mean, think about this. As you're going to provision or expose templates to your end user base or your business units, and they go in to that self-service portal and they provision a service that consists of 5 VMs. They test for 6 months, and there's data in that test. They decide they're done, so they go back to the self-service portal and they decommission their environment, only to realize 3 days later that, oops, we forgot to copy off some data. Harold, John, Dan, whoever, can you please go back and grab that data for us? Well, if you didn't back that up, how are you going to get that data if you literally demolished the VMs already, right? It wasn't put into some backup library. So you do need to have backup in your production environment, and therefore you need to test how that's going to work in your lab environment, right? I'm sharing with you things that I wish we could implement in ours so that we can test it and demo it as well and show you how it's done with all of our technology end to end. But we can't do that. So hopefully that's something you don't forget about, right, is the backup component. And then therefore the restore of that so that you can actually go back and grab something even after it's been deleted. Question is, did I use the unified installer that you keep hearing about? And it's on the thumb drive. The answer is no. When we built this environment out back in early November, actually October timeframe, the unified installer didn't exist. It wasn't even in beta. At least if it was in beta, they didn't tell me about it, so I couldn't even use it. The unified installer is there today, but honestly, I haven't really played with the RTM version. I did work with it during the release candidate beta or the beta phase when it finally did come out. And even then, there's certain aspects that you have to have already done, and it doesn't handle every scenario, right? I mean, imagine the different scenarios that you have access to. It doesn't handle everything, but it does do some basic scenarios that might fit for most environments, especially in a lab. So it does do a check for prereqs to make sure that you've got the prereqs met, if that's what you're asking. Yes, it does. Mm-hmm.
So my name is Nick Smith. I'm a data center SSP. And on your thumb drives have everything but the prereqs for ConfigMan. If you go download them separately and just put them on a USB stick or on a local drive, you can hydrate everything that System Center is on a 24 gig server with local disk in 3 hours. So you can use PowerShell if you want to build your VMs with a differencing disk. I've done this for about 6 customers so far. You take a VHD with a Windows Server, sysprep it, use PowerShell to hydrate 9 VMs or 8 VMs, plus I use Windows 7 for my SCUI install for System Center Unified Installer. Then use it to create domain join your machines, all that kind of stuff. Have 8 of those VMs, 1 for every component of System Center, and then an additional one for the data warehouse for Service Manager. Then put SCUI on the Win 7 VM, and then when you run through that install, about 2.5, depending on your disks, 2.5 to 3 hours later, you'll have all of System Center installed, not configured to work together, but installed on, you can do it actually on about a 16 gig host if you really trick it up, but it needs about 2 gigs per VM. So if you take what you have, that's why that drive is so cool. It's got everything that you need from the prereq perspective to do an entire lab, right? It's going to do local SQL, everything else, but it'll give you a lab you can go in and start playing with in a matter of hours.
See, and I didn't have that.
You didn't
I
have that.
wish I did. It would have saved me a lot of time. But remember, you still have to have the VMs or the servers pre-installed so that when you run the unified installer, it has something to go put stuff on.
It's
right?
USB in your back.
Yeah. Right? Because when I first heard the unified installer, I thought it would actually literally install the OS for me too, but it doesn't. But once again, if you don't know what you don't know, then you got to learn from that and don't make that mistake again. Because I didn't know that when I first started playing. I'm like, oh, unified installer. Harold doesn't read documentation. Right? And I just ran the setup. I'm like, okay, go. Oh, I need some servers. What do you mean you're not going to install the OS? Oh, okay. And that makes sense. Right? The unified installer is to install System Center, not to install the OS. Right? Exchange doesn't install the OS for me. I still have to have that installed. But I didn't think about that. I didn't think that through. So, yes? So the question is, the documentation that my team built, will we make it available to the public? We can, absolutely. We probably need to do some updating so that we can. But it's going to be out of date because it's based on release candidate stuff. We probably should do a refresh based on RTM. Yeah, absolutely. So I will make sure that by... No. So not the end of next week, on my blog, I will post a document. Right? I'll go through and refresh it and make sure it's got at least all the up-to-date stuff that we've done to it in the document, and then I'll publish it. And I'll be honest, though, when Dan goes in and does something, and he's modifying things, if he doesn't tell me or he doesn't update the document on his own, it's not going to be in the document. So yeah, we'll just remember, we just blame Dan for everything. But we like to blame Dan, because so far Dan has brought down our environment, twice. I brought down the environment 0 times. Okay, no, once. So, I mean, what time is it? I think we're almost out of time. I have 5:03. I want to make sure that if you have questions, that you can ask the questions, and we can take time answering those questions. Great question. Is the TMG server virtual as well? No, it isn't. So another partner by the name of Celestix gave us a TMG appliance that is in that rack as well. Right? So that's providing some of the internet connectivity for us. And the way we connect to everything is through an RD gateway. So we do have a remote desktop gateway, VDI with Win7 machines going, and that's what I log into. Right? I'm logging into a Win7 machine that's hosted as a VM on the VDI server, and I do that via remote desktop gateway services. That's how we connect to everything. So Dan has his own place he can log into,
I've got
and
mine.
so does John.
Yep.
And we don't all try to log directly into the server, or we can cause problems. Although right now I am logged directly into that server, so hopefully Bob wasn't, and I didn't kick him off. Does that answer your question? So, any other questions?
I know we're between you and the evening activities, so.
I mean, was this useful information for you, though?
Good.
If you think of anything else that you said, boy, sure would be nice, you didn't talk about X, Y, and Z, but did you do that? And if so, can you please share?
Yep.
Email us.
Email us, contact
Right?
us on our
Send
blog
us
or on
things
Twitter.
on Twitter or whatever so that we can kind of include that. Honestly, I plan to rebuild this environment with Server 2012 beta so that we can start doing things on the forefront again. Question here and then over there. Always keep a backdoor to the system. My backdoor is I call up Groupware Technology, and I say, Nick or Ed, can you please, and they have the passwords because I trust them, and they can go in and do stuff for me if I can't get to it remotely. Yes?
Yep.
I was noticing that on all the documentation, the System Center 2012, everything needs SQL Server 2008 R2.
Correct.
Now that 2012's out, is there going to need to be
So
Repeat is good. Question, yeah, so.
supported or patches?
the first comment and then the question. The comment is, you've noticed in all the System Center 2012 documentation that SQL 2008 R2 or 2008 is required. now that SQL 2012 is out, will we update all of our stuff to then support SQL 2012 as well? So I suspect that that will get updated and we will support it. But today, it looks very specifically at the version of SQL. And if you don't meet the prereqs as they are today, it won't install. Right? I tried, and it didn't work.
And you can imagine there's going to be an update when Windows Server 12 ships, and so that might be an appropriate time to make an update like that. But I don't think we've made any public statements yet as when or if that will happen.
Well, use the version of SQL that the documentation tells you should use.
Right.
And to be honest, let's ask, how many of you have actually already upgraded your SQL servers to SQL 2012? All of them?
1, 2, 3, maybe 4. Yeah.
Right? So you guys still have 2008 R2, and I'm willing to bet a good portion of you still have SQL 2005.
Yep.
Yeah, right? Right? And Windows XP.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so his learnings or experiences that Virtual Machine Manager can use SQL 2012, but everything else will not. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and that was the other thing we learned during the beta, because once again, Harold doesn't read documentation, and as I started to play with it, I'm like, SQL 2008 R2 is the latest version of SQL. I installed SQL 2008 R2, applied the latest patches, updates, service packs, go to install System Center release candidate, and it says your version of SQL is incompatible. How can it be? It's the latest version with all the latest patches. And then I finally read the minute information, and I'm like, crap. Right? I got to backport to SQL 2008 or remove Service Pack 1. Right? And apply only this cumulative update. So it was very specific during the beta and the release candidate phase. And even at RTM, we are looking for certain versions because that's where they've done the testing to ensure that it is supported. And we all know that when a new version of something like SQL comes out, there's a lot of changes to the back-end infrastructure, to the way the database is structured. And the last thing you want to do is, even though it might install, I want to make sure that when it installs in production, it's also supported. And you want to make sure that the product team actually takes the time to do the regression testing to ensure that none of the new functionality or whatnot or changes affect the way System Center works. Right? I know I'm being recorded, but I'm going to stand by that. Right? It may not be the official stance, but I like to follow supported stuff in a production environment because then I know when I have problems, I can call support from any vendor, right, and get support. That's in a lab, we probably don't care, but in production, we do care.
Can we put our contact information back up here? Let's see if people want to get back to it. There we go. So there again, there's our emails. Our business cards are up here on the bottom of the stage if you want to grab those. Any other questions? We'll stick around for a few minutes for others if you don't want to ask in a public forum. Thank you all very much.
Yep,
Enjoy
thank you.
your evening.